Good afternoon, evening, morning, whenever you are watching this. This is Deborah Roth from Spirited Living, and I'm here again this week with another journey into the divine feminine, looking at these really deep and powerful archetypes of the goddesses around the world. And if you want to know more about why I'm doing this in the divine feminine, you can, at the end of this video on YouTube, there's a place where you can click on some other videos that talk about the divine feminine. So if you're watching this on Instagram, go watch there. And so, very briefly, I believe that that's how the planet will be saved, is if we all embody gender-free, doesn't matter whether you're male or female, the qualities of the divine feminine, which are embodied in the goddess representations from around the world. This week, I have to admit, I'm the goddess that I brought in I've discovered was under false pretenses. And that is the Mesopotamian Goddess Ishtar, who is very closely connected, and in so many ways, whenever she's talked about, she's talked about as Ishtar slash Inanna. And Inanna is often the bigger name. The reason that I'm saying she's here under false pretenses is that this weekend is Easter on Sunday, and Passover starts Friday night. But Easter on Sunday, I had just, those of you that have been watching here know that I even though you can watch these any time of the year and draw, wisdom and information from any one of the goddesses whenever you want, I often, usually really, try to tie them in with ancient festivals of theirs around the world, or seasonal, that kind of thing. So I've just heard through my goddess grapevine for years that Ishtar was connected with Easter, and perhaps even where the name Easter came from. Even though I know, and I actually did another Inner Goddess Team video a year ago for what is truly, there's been more research about this, most likely where the name Easter came from, and that's actually the Germanic goddess Eostre, E-O-S-T-R-E. Ishtar was a powerful goddess in her own right, and in fact was the first one that was depicted in poetry. The first, let's see if I can find her name. Interesting, and it was a woman, which is kind of cool, who brought her to life in poetry in 2300 BCE. Ahandwana. The earliest poems to Ishtar were written by her. She was the world's first individually identified author. Isn't that cool that that was a woman? So she's told the story of Ishtar, and which many of you know, and which I know and associated with Inanna. And in all the fun research that I did, there's a wonderful piece that I got from the Brooklyn Museum, and particularly in their representation of Ishtar in Judy Chicago's massive, extraordinary piece there called The Dinner Party, that shows place settings representing, oh gosh, I don't remember, a couple hundred goddesses, famous women through history. She actually has a separate place setting. She created separate place settings for Ishtar and Inanna. So definitely, if I remember, I will post the link for that, because that was a very cool article about Ishtar and Inanna, well, Ishtar and Inanna separately. So the story of Inanna, very briefly, she is considered the goddess, the Mesopotamian goddess. That's the earlier rendition of, let's see, a goddess of Venus. She delighted in bodily love. She was the protectress of sacred prostitutes and patrons of alehouses. She was really particularly known to be a goddess of love and war, of sexual intimacy, and like Vesta, and we've talked about this before, talking about Vesta, treated sex as a sacred act. That's where that phrase "sacred prostitutes" comes from. So in that capacity, she, when in her myth, in the myth of Inanna slash Ishtar, there's a point where she is killed, and at that moment, for that period of time before she returns from the underworld, there's no more sexual intimacy or fertility happening on the earth. And of course, all the gods and goddesses, kind of like when Persephone descended into the underworld. So I'll tell you briefly what that is. And she is, so Inanna was considered the queen of the heavens in her personification. She was the Sumerian goddess that came later and was in some ways a little better known. And she was, there are a couple versions of the story. The story that I always heard was that she was going to visit her sister in the underworld, Ereshkigal, who had lost her husband, whose husband was killed, and who was in deep mourning. And the idea is that Inanna, Ishtar, descends to the underworld to comfort her sister. The other version, which I hadn't heard, is that because she's the goddess, Ishtar, Inanna, is the goddess of war and of battles, and in fact she's depicted very often, if you can see this, with all kinds of weapons, and she's she's crushing a lion in her under her feet, and she Ereshkigal is actually pretty certain that Inanna's coming down to visit her to make a hostile takeover, so to speak, a divine, sacred, hostile takeover of the underworld. So she puts her through the ropes. Inanna, Ishtar, has dressed herself in her most elegant costumes and jewelry and everything else. And at each of the 7 gates to the underworld, Ereshkigal demands that her demons demand that Inanna, Ishtar remove one thing after another in order to be able to descend to see Ereshkigal. So she does. So she appears to Ereshkigal naked, and Ereshkigal kills her. In order for her, and then that's when all sexual intimacy and fertility and love dies in the upper world. In order to come back to life, she is allowed to go back up and have someone replace her, which is where the phrase, and this was a phrase that came out, there's an ancient Mesopotamian saying, "No one comes back from the underworld unmarked." So Ishtar descends with these demons, Ishtar, Inanna, and is trying to figure out who she's going to send as her replacement. She sees her loyal priestess, Ninshubur, who is mourning, and she, and her brothers are all mourning, and they have rags on, and they're improper. They're mourning her death. Then she sees her consort, Tammuz or Tammuz, depending on which version you're reading, who's sitting in royally decked out on her throne, clearly not concerned that she's died. And in her anger, she sends him down. She basically kills him and sends him down to the underworld to take her place. So she's not someone to mess with. So when we look at the qualities of these goddesses and how we want to call on them, when we need that kind of energy, when we need that archetypal connection to accomplish or be nurtured or be supported or healed or whatever, she's often thought of as this goddess of vengeance. But another take on it, and of course I always love to look for the feminist take on things, is that she's actually represents loyalty and being faithful, because Ninshubur, who was faithful to her, is rewarded by not being killed, basically. So in terms of how you can use this powerful energy, this Ishtar, Inanna powerful energy, it would be first of all, she is the god of love and war, of sexual intimacy. So she'd be a nice one to call on if you want to make some whoopee, which as we move into the lusty month of May, we're getting closer to that. And it really doesn't have to be, as we know, you can make whoopee anytime you want. It doesn't have to be May Day or any other time. We'll talk about that in a couple weeks when we come up to the Taurus new moon that was actually the day before May Day this year. So when you want to call on, so the things that you can use, that you can call on Ishtar for would be for wonderful, intimate sexual relations, for sacred sex. Remember, she protected the sexual prostitutes, that the sacred prostitutes who made love as an act of offering to their goddess. She's also the goddess of storms and rain and thunderstorms. I've been looking out the window here in New York City and watching these dark clouds and hoping they wait until I go to my evening rehearsal for my women's chorus before they open up water on me. So I could reach out to Ishtar on my way to my rehearsal tonight and ask for her blessing to wait until I get inside. But I really love the loyalty connection too. So think about all those things and call on her in whatever way feels meaningful, feels supportive and helpful for you in the days and weeks ahead. Certainly in this time, even though she's not really connected to Easter, even though Ishtar sounds a lot like Easter, I ended up finding out that's not the case. But I invite you to just try on and do your own exploration of Ishtar and how she can really support you in all these ways that I've talked about. I'd love to hear. Please do comment. Join my YouTube channel if you haven't, and let me know. I always love to hear. I get wonderful comments from people on all these different goddesses I've done over the last 2 years. So would love to hear your experience with Ishtar. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you next week at this time. Well, maybe not this time, could be another day, but thanks so much. Wonderful to be with you. Namaste.